This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, a lot going on right now. I mean, above and beyond, all the catastrophes with the Delta variant and the situation in Afghanistan, we're going to be talking about what's happening closer to Palestine in addition to some other things. You've did a really amazing interview with a human rights attorney, Stanley Cohen, who's trying to get the Israelis removed from a seat at the African Union as an observer, which I didn't even know about. It seems kind of crazy that the Israelis have an observer status at the African Union when they're so involved in destabilizing the region. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the shenanigans that the Democrats are doing in Congress with the Iron Dome appropriation money, taking it out, putting it back in, using the question of Palestine as a pawn to get other things done. And then finally, this is part of our ongoing discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about Iraq war vet, Michael Preisner, who actually attempted to disrupt President Bush's it wasn't really a mea culpa. It was kind of his attempt to rewrite history, which all presidents do, obviously. But Bush's attempt to rewrite what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan is especially disturbing, and we'll have a discussion about that too.
Yeah, so just part of the so-called Abraham Accords. That's why you said most people don't know about Israel's sneaking the back doorway to the African Union as an observer. Imagine this is a country that practices apartheid, that has been labeled as an apartheid regime by Human Rights Watch, by its own human rights organization, B'Tselem, and it faces the largest objection from where? From South Africa, which suffered under apartheid, yet through bribery and all kinds of things, which Attorney Stanley Cohen will talk about. Attorney Stanley Cohen is a human rights attorney. He's an activist also. He, along with a group of lawyers, activists, and researchers from various countries. It's an international, basically, attempt. By the way, they submitted a petition to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights this September 16th, basically demanding that the African Union rethink it and revoke its recent decision to admit Israel as an observer. Let's watch Stanley Cohen. Israel was admitted to the African Union as an observer state in July this year, a decision that came as a shock to several member countries given Israel's sustained and ongoing repression of the Palestinian people. A group of lawyers, activists, and researchers from various countries submitted a petition to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on September 16, demanding that the African Union revoke its recent decision to admit Israel as an observer state. Parties to the petition include the Palestine Solidarity Alliance, Johannesburg-based think tank Media Review Network, U.S.-based lawyer Stanley Cohen, and South African lawyers Nadeem Muhammad and Shabnam Mayet, as well as other signatories from Belgium, Ireland, and the United States. Joining us to discuss this and more, attorney Stanley Cohen. Welcome to Arab Talk, Stanley.
Thank you so very much. It's good to speak with you, and welcome to your audience.
So before we get started in the legal case, just in the past few months, Israel was described as an apartheid state, not only by the Human Rights Watch, but also by an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, yet it managed to achieve observer status at the African Union. How did it manage to do this?
Israel has spent the better part of its entire existence developing, honing largely corrupt relationships with various European colonial project states in Africa. It was one of the last states to support apartheid in South Africa. It exchanged technology for nuclear weapons to the apartheid regime in exchange for resources it needed for its own nuclear program. It has sold literally billions of dollars worth of weapons, including weapons that were used in the genocide in Rwanda. It's involved itself in Angola, in a variety of other states. So it has an old and almost exclusively corrupt relationship with either colonial projects that were still in existence on the ground in the continent of Africa, or which are surviving, functioning today through proxy states with corruption, with bribes, with paybacks, with weapons. So Israel felt comfortable enough to move, and interestingly, they didn't move when the African Union was sitting, but they moved after 20 years of failing to obtain observer status to get that status by an executive fiat by one or two representatives of the African Union without a formal vote, without a debate, without a discussion. So it's another example of Israel sneaking in through the back door what it can never accomplish because of its lack of integrity and its history of war crimes and apartheid through the front door.
So I think it's a 200-page petition. It is stated that, and I'm quoting here, the human rights violations committed by Israel are contrary to the spirit and purport of the Charter of the African Union, particularly relating to issues of self-determination and decolonization, as Israel continues to illegally occupy Palestine in violations of its international obligations and multiple UN resolutions. Does this mean that the African Union is violating its own charter?
Well, it means that those people that through executive fiat embraced Israel and opened the door to walk in are in clear violations of its own charter. If you take a look, as in the introduction to our brief, we just cite 10 or 12 of the constitutions of a cross-section of African states in the north, the south, the west, the east. And if you follow the clear read of their own constitutional edict, their own protection, their own intent and purpose, it is a clear violation of their own charter to permit a serial human rights abuser such as Israel to come in to play any role in the discussions, in the meetings, in the politics, and the strategy of the African states, of the African Union.
So just to make it clear, the petitioners don't seek really justice, from the African Union on the issue of war crimes against Palestine by Israel, right? That's not the objective. But the objective is just really what's really the real objective.
Well, keep in mind that there are a number of African states in the African Union that have universal jurisdiction, that have brought war crimes prosecutions under their state constitution, under the African Union, in essence, the charter, against Israel for violations of human rights, for violations of war crimes, for violations of the law of war, for apartheid. This is an effort that says to the African Union, follow your own constitution, follow your own law, follow your own procedure, which has evolved as a result of 100 years of European colonial projects. Do not embrace, do not welcome, do not admit this serial human rights abuser to participate in a process that has been fought for 100 years to obtain. So the justice my clients, our clients, and the other persons involved in seeking is application of the African Union Charter, application of the constitutional edicts of the 54 or 55 states of the African Union.
So in the complaint, you list several egregious violations stemming from basically Israeli apartheid. You talk about disposition from the land, denial of citizenship and rights, denial of freedom of movement, economic subjugation, political representation. Please talk about these.
Sure. Look, obviously we speak about the slaughter in Gaza. We speak about the system, the unconstitutional, the illegal system of detention. We speak about, and it's interesting because we compare the numbers of those detained, arrested, prosecuted, and have lost their lives in South Africa under apartheid versus in Palestine under apartheid. And it's 20-1 in terms of the nightmare of Palestine. But in terms of the other complaints that we file, they parallel the classic traditional findings that applied to South Africa. all of the fundamental linchpins of what Israel maintains, whether it is in the classic occupied territory, quote unquote, post 67, or for the so-called 48 Palestinians, it is identical to the very tripwires, the very reasons, the very causes which led the world to boycott South Africa, to break the back of apartheid, to refuse to accept it in the world community. So what we are reminding the Commission and what we are reminding the African Union is you are embracing not just apartheid, and not just apartheid that recently has come of age, but it's been there for decades, but you are welcoming in the very type of political, social, and civil society that you rejected in South Africa, that you rejected in what was in Zimbabwe, that was rejected in African states throughout the African continent, where whether it was the French, whether it was the English, whether it was the Germans, whether it was the Portuguese, we must remember that for well over a century, it was the home base of European colonial projects, which imposed, which enforced, which applied the very linchpin of apartheid, of discrimination, of colonial oppression that is today and has been for 73 years Israel.
What do you think is the reason behind Israel's really trying to expand its influence over Africa? I mean, what's its main goal?
Well, there are two separate goals. Number one is Israel remains one of the world's largest, one of the world's most prolific weapon manufacturers and salespersons. They have a contract with one of the member states of the African Union, I believe, for $1.6 billion this year. They have sold billions of dollars to the African continent over the years in terms of the despots, in terms of despotic regimes, in terms of weapons, now in terms of surveillance techniques. So there's two benefits for Israel. Number one, you have the economic incentive where they drop billions of dollars of weapons, which provokes internal dispute and, in fact, civil war in some location. And then there is this attempt, and you see it with the so-called Abraham Accords, to develop relationships, to develop warming relationships with Arab and Middle Eastern states in an effort to say, you see, we can exist. We will deal with this justly. So it's part of the Israeli propaganda mechanism. It's part of the Israeli approach to basically cover what it's doing to Palestinians through a wrap or embrace of the African Union, saying, look, if the 50 some odd states of the African Union would welcome us, would embrace us, would say we're good people, then why won't the rest of the world, where there are problems, where they think we are problematic in terms of Palestine, enter into it? We'll discuss it. We'll work on it. We'll talk about it. Meanwhile, the dispossession, the destruction, the murder, the detention, the land theft goes on and on and on. Israel has always sought to expand the cover for its war crimes in Palestine.
So what are the remedies? Because I know you've listed some remedies. I mean, at the end of the day, what are the remedies that you're seeking from the African Union?
Keep in mind, South Africa announced just yesterday or 2 days ago that it planned with a group of other states to bring to the floor of the African Union meeting, the legislature, in essence, in October, to push this issue, to debate this issue, to discuss this issue, and to move to have Israel's status stripped. We seek a number of relief. In the interim, we seek what's known as a demand for discovery, which asks for the background, the circumstances, the agreements, the deals, whether there's any payoffs, whether any contracts, whether any agreements between those in the African Union that are saying welcome to Israel and Israel. We ask for an opportunity to engage in an oral argument and invite Israeli lawyers or Israel itself to join us to debate the issue, to provide the broadest brush of information about facts and circumstances in Africa. We ask for an interim relief of suspending the observer status until it's resolved. We ask for a permanent relief from the Commission that says strip them of their observer status. But then again, the High Court of the African Union, which is a classic civil traditional court, can take this case. There can be full hearings, as there could be before the Commission, with witnesses, with testimony, with a judicial process that could end up passing a law that says, no, you can't do this. They're not allowed in. And as can the African Union legislature. The body itself can turn around in October and in November and say, we're reversing this. This was a decision made by a handful of people that have very close relationships to Israel. We're reversing it. We're stripping Israel of its observer status and removing it.
So on one hand, I mean, as I started earlier, Human Rights Watch said that Israel is an apartheid state or has apartheid practices. But at the same time, Israel is making headways with the so-called Abraham Accords, with infiltrating the African Union. And there are polls now that show, for example, a lot of American Jews are kind of waking up and saying no to Israel. Yesterday, I wanted to get your opinion on this in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. There was an article that one of Israel's iconic Zionist families and former member of the Shin Bet, Yaakov Sharet, of course, is 95 years old, has become now anti-Zionist and encourages people to leave Israel. The title of the article was pretty shocking, really. Israel was born in sin. I mean, this is what he described Israel as. Do you feel that there is a shift now, I mean, in this kind of sentiment towards the state of Israel?
Well, what I find paradoxical is, for 100 years, and more particularly for 73 years, Israel has tried to conflate Judaism with Zionism, as if this 3,000-year-old or 5,000-year-old faith was floating around looking for a leadership to tell them what to do and who they were and what they are, that all of a sudden showed up in the guise of basically agnostics from Poland, atheists from Europe, who announced it. So what's interesting is it is the rhetoric, the propaganda, the hasbara, the sale has worked only so long. And the paradox is what began as we speak for Jews, we represent Jews, we protect Jews. Increasingly, more and more Jews, especially young Jews in the West, are rejecting this, have come to grips with the fact that Israel is a rogue state, commits gross violations of human rights and violations of international law, and embraces an apartheid state. So they are beginning to move away from the embrace and support of the next generation of young Jews throughout the world who are saying, no, we want no part of this. We want no support for this Zionist entity. And they're finding comfort in evangelical Christians, perhaps in the African Union, perhaps in other areas. So we have this move from we speak for and protect Judaism to now an acknowledgement that we speak for and protect ourselves. And we'll make a deal with any devil anywhere that we can. We'll sell weapons. We'll bribe representatives of government. We'll have corrupt leaders. We'll provide surveillance information to states to spy on their civilians. We will support despotic regimes. We will insinuate ourselves into war crimes just so that we can survive. Not as if they call it a nation state, and yes, it's built upon the notion of the superiority of Judaism, but increasingly it is clear this is a national, political, European colonial project, which at all costs will do anything that it can to survive. And now, as increasing numbers of Jews, old Jews, for example, rest in peace, my parents, who were Zionists as young kids and raised money for the Zionist state well before 1948, as they aged, they rejected it. They said, this is a bad place doing bad things. Zionism is a bad situation, and we reject it. So that is happening increasingly. And with that, Israel is growing more and more desperate to develop new people to just blindly embrace the rhetoric, blindly ignore the facts that this is a monster state that has committed war crimes for 73 years and left to its own device will continue in perpetuity.
Do you feel there is a shift within the American government? I mean, also on this topic, also within the past 48 hours, a small group of progressive Democrats, objected to giving $1 more billion to Israel in military aid. I mean, this is practically unheard of in the past decades.
Yeah, I think there's a change underfoot. You've got increasingly younger, more astute, more experienced political people in Congress. They come from communities of political activists. They come from communities of progressives. They come from communities that understand what Israel has done. They understand very well that the U.S. is complicit, that this is a violation of the Arms Export Control Act, that you reach a point, the disconnect of saying to Afghanistan, of saying to Iraq, of saying to Libya, of saying to Syria, we're removing, we're detaching, we can no longer become involved or maintain a presence and these terrible situations at the same time that we will blindly embrace a Zionist killing machine is palpable, it is clear, it is painful, and increasingly younger representatives in Congress, people that are more astute, people that understand the big picture about who Israel is, what Israel is, and what it has done with almost $300 billion in U.S. money, which has supported war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and apartheid. We are beginning to see a shift. We are beginning to see a move by younger congressional representatives. And I suspect Israel understands very well that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, unless there are some very dramatic breaks with its history, with its practices, unless there is a true move towards liberation, justice, and equality and self-determination for Palestinians, they are going to see an end of this dutiful blind support by the U.S. Congress.
Stanley Cohen, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and my best to all the listeners.
That's the voice in the face of human rights attorney Stanley Cohen. Really great interview, Jamal. And I think, again, most people wouldn't know that, but I didn't even know it. And I try to stay on top of the news. But in apartheid state, having a seat at the table as an observer with the African Union seems not just hypocritical, but really kind of dangerous in terms of potential destabilization in the region. And as you rightly pointed out, South Africa, which is one of the largest critics of the apartheid state in Israel, is part of the African Union. So this was a very eye-opening and compelling interview you did with Stanley Cohen.
I mean, here is a continent, Jess, that suffered from various colonialists, be it Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, you name it. They've all had a foothold in Africa. I mean, to bring a colonialist regime, Israel, to bring an apartheid regime to be an observer, it's absurd.
It is absurd. But here's the thing, Jamal. It's part of Israel's attempt to whitewash itself on the international stage. And the Abraham Accords and the agreements with Jordan and Egypt are all attempts to whitewash the apartheid regime's image globally, as well and especially here in the United States. So, this came up also this week, which is equally disturbing. You had the King of Morocco and one of his foreign ministers saying that Israel needs to be a full partner in the Middle East peace process. So all this kind of hypocritical, really dangerous political statements attempting to whitewash a really kind of, not just human rights abuses, but, criminal human rights abuses that the Israelis have been engaged with now over 73 years. This is all their attempt to whitewash that away, to attempt to rewrite the history, to present itself in a different light. So, kudos to Stanley Cohen and his group for calling out the Israelis for this, grotesque act of hypocrisy with the African Union.
Well, I mean, also the timing could not have been more transparent and obvious.
Exactly.
With Israel, like as we've talked about it on this show, and we've had experts talk about it, when Israel was declared as an apartheid state, when Israel is facing its own issues from within, from its own human rights organizations,
right?
When you have the international, the ICC is looking into Israeli war crimes. All these things,
exactly.
And then you have this global, what we call global Hasbara campaign to what you're saying, whitewash Israel's image, be it the Abraham Accords or what they're trying to offer the King of Morocco, it's all about now, it's like, it's all so transactional. I mean, why don't you accept Israel and we'll give you more money, more US aid, more weapons, what have you.
Okay.
I mean, that's the game that they've been playing.
Right. So here's my statement, Jamal. You want to do transactional politics? Fine. Do transactional politics. Then let the people who believe in human rights and justice and who believe in the International Criminal Court use our form of transactional justice by engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanctioning of the Israeli apartheid regime. You want to do your form of buying off the king of Morocco and buying off the African Union and buying off what's happening in South Sudan, and you want to buy off the, Sisi in Egypt, fine, be transactional. But then we have the right, as people who believe in justice and human rights and the International Criminal Court, to use the BDS as our transactional method to hold the Israeli apartheid regime accountable. So you can't have it both ways.
One word, double standards.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
this is
right.
what brought down apartheid South Africa.
Exactly.
And,
that's right.
And if you dare to practice, and we've seen what happened to Ben and Jerry's, right? We've seen what happens to professors at universities getting fired from just by saying no to Israel. This is the hypocrisy. I would say double standards and hypocrisy. So it's two words really: hypocrisy and double standards.
Absolutely.
And that's what's going on. On this topic, Jess, that's another thing about double standards.
Speaking of hypocrisy, let's look at the Democrats and the Congress and their hypocrisy.
Here we are trying to recover from a devastating pandemic. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. Millions of Americans are still looking for jobs. Businesses have filed for bankruptcies. We have all kinds of issues. Congress refused, I should say, actually, it's the administration refused to forgive student loans, which makes sense. Like, we need to educate people. They refuse to do that, right?
That's right.
Actually, Congress wants to do that, but there is a resistance from the administration. Yet, we are willing to write another $1 billion check to Israel.
For the Iron Dome of all things.
Yeah. So now we briefly spoke about that because that was starting, as you know, progressives in Congress, when this issue came about the replenishing, basically, Israeli American-made missiles to Israel for their Iron Dome, giving them the money for that. Progressives in Congress, and I should mention them: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Betty McCollum, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Pramila Jayapal, and Jamal Bowman, among others. They said, no way. You're not going to sneak in the $1 billion, as we're trying to balance, do gymnastics, basically. It's all debt, like raising the debt ceiling. It's just sinking us more into debt. I don't know. Do you have a printer for money in your house, Jess?
I don't.
But I think that's what the government does every time they need money. Just print more $100 bills, and then these Congress people, they have the audacity to just say, okay, let's give part of that. Let's give $1 billion to Israel. So the progressives said no way, and they basically stalled this bill to avoid a shutdown, because otherwise, every year we get to that point where we have to raise the ceiling. We're just getting more and more in debt to avoid a government shutdown.
That's right. And
so now there's a new trick. They said, okay, we won't put it within this bill. Let's have a standalone bill.
Standalone bill.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
A standalone bill.
So they've managed, and I feel really bad, and I commend these congressmen and congresswomen for their action to do that, for a change, which is like unheard of, to say, no, we're not going to give a carte blanche to Israel every time you ask for it. But unfortunately, they are a minority.
Well, they're a minority, and they're being pushed on by Nancy Pelosi and the other Democrats, and all this hypocrisy around, ending endless wars and not, and you listen to Biden's speech at the United Nations, we have to come together. We can't fight these endless wars. Well, the Israelis have been in an endless war against Palestine and against Palestinians going on 73 years. And these progressive members of Congress, they're not even asking in this particular instance to stop all, funding of the apartheid regime, which ultimately is where we need to be. They're really focusing on one thing and one thing alone: the extra $1 billion for the Iron Dome. And you're right, we have to give him credit for at least calling it out for what it is, confronting it. But, the majority of the Congress and the Senate is going to find a way to give this high technology weaponry back to the Israelis and give them another $1 billion. It's at a level of hypocrisy, Jamal. I mean, I don't even know what to call it anymore, except they're being held hostage. I mean, we know this.
Well, you're 100% correct. Unfortunately, Israel is going to get what it's asking for. And this effort is led by House Appropriations Chair, right, Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut right, Democrat, who introduced the bill. And she's acting as if Israel, I'm going to read some of her statements. She's acting as if Israel is not the occupier and it's not the aggressor. She says, the United States' commitment to the security of our friend and ally Israel is ironclad, replenishing the interceptors used to protect Israel from attacks is our legal and moral responsibility. No, your legal and moral responsibility is to the American public, not to a foreign country. Is to the millions who are suffering in this country. I mean, to see this, just number one, of course, we see the hypocrisy and double standards. You're talking about a country, and I was like, you know what? Let's see what is this. But by the way, before we get into this, her supporters, we should name them. Number one, of course, they did this. This announcement came amid pressure from the Israel lobby. You guessed it, AIPAC. Who else? And its surrogates in Congress, such as Representatives Ted Deutsch, Kathy Manning, Josh Gottheimer, Richie Torres, Brad Schneider, and there is a whole list, because I was trying to see who are pushing, who are lining behind the House Appropriations Chair. And of course, the other thing is, because you have to read sometimes between the lines and what happened. Hoyer, Steny
Hoyer, right?
Yeah, Steny Hoyer announcement, and he's the U.S. House Majority Leader. Steny Hoyer announcement came because he made that announcement. We're going to go through, another bill. We'll let this thing go. After he spoke to who? The Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. There was a phone call. So this is all this on Tuesday night. And during the phone call, Lapid was reassured that the move was a technical delay. Here he's giving him kind of like the inner discussion, like within Congress. Don't worry, the $1 billion, you're going to have the $1 billion. This is just a technical delay. Sure. Related to discussions over the U.S. debt ceiling, and that the defense funding would be approved at a later date.
So that goes back to your other point, Jamal, that you have a member of Congress reassuring a representative of another country. We're back to this thing, like you said. Are we thinking about the 30 million American children who go to bed hungry every night? Are we thinking about the homeless issue? Are we thinking about all the people who've lost their jobs? The people who don't have access to healthcare in the middle of the Delta pandemic, the COVID pandemic and the Delta variant? No. We're bending over backwards to reassure a foreign minister or a defense minister or a prime minister of another country that regardless of what's happening to our citizens and our mandate to protect and serve U.S. citizens, we're going to give you that $1 billion. Do you really understand what $1 billion can do for what's happening in the United States right now across all sectors. So Steny Hoyer, okay, and all of the other, bootlickers of the appropriations chair who want to, put aside what's happening in the United States and the children who don't have enough food and all the other crises that are going around, just to give the Israelis $1 billion more. We have to come up with new words for it, Jamal, because it's beyond hypocrisy. It really is. If you look at the damage that it does to American strategic interests and the damage that it does in terms of how it promotes the killing of more Palestinian civilians, women, and children, there's got to be a word for this that goes above and beyond just hypocrisy, because this is not just hypocrisy.
Well, just there is another bit of information maybe you're not aware of, or at least I know a lot of our audience, they're not aware of. And this is information from the World Bank. This is about the gross domestic product, GDP in Israel. Do you know that Israel is ahead of our neighbors to the north, Canada? That Israel's, this is from the World Bank. Israel GDP per capita is $43,689 for 2020. This is based on 2020. Is ahead of Canada, which is 43,278. It's ahead of New Zealand, which is 41,127. It's ahead of the UK, which is $40,406.
Wow.
So when we're talking about US aid, you are giving money to a wealthy country. Just think about it. Israel is ranked now ahead of Canada.
Unbelievable.
Ahead of our neighbors. Do we give Canada billions of dollars every year?
No.
I mean, it's ahead of the UK.
No.
Imagine that.
No.
So it's not like you're giving even it's unfair when we criticize the US military aid that is given to Egypt, for example, because Egypt or Jordan, second recipient. Egypt is a poor country. Egypt has 100 million people.
Right.
Who live below, most of them live below the poverty line.
That's right.
You're not talking about, Egypt has 100 million people to Israel's 8.6 million, even including the West Bank, wherever you don't have 15 million. This is including even the West Bank. Right?
Well, Jamal, I think, you're bringing up a really critical point. I mean, we can do all the political analyses we want, but if you look at the raw economic realities, this kind of largesse and money being handed over to the Israelis to buy more weapons and to fund their war machine, from a strictly economic point of view, you're right, doesn't make sense given that level of GDP. But let's remember what President Biden said. He basically, and I'm paraphrasing him and Antony Blinken, who said our foreign policy is going to be based on morality, doing the right thing, and not based on, anything else. I mean, giving the Israelis another billion on top of the 3.5 billion, on top of the loan guarantees. It's what is it? $7 to $8 billion a year when you include all of the support in its many forms to one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
I just want to end with one thing, because we want to talk about also George W. How can we forget?
Yes.
It's been a while, right? So if you wonder, ladies and gentlemen, why Israel has national health insurance and Americans don't, here is the answer. Really. This is, even amidst this pandemic, we know the big issue is that millions of Americans are uninsured, right? Israel has a national health insurance. We know Canada has a national health insurance. The United States does not. And we just give money to a country that has national health insurance that is economically better than Canada. It's kind of ridiculous. I don't know if it's the hypocrisy. Maybe we should add the word stupidity.
Well, I think Yeah, I think that's right, Jamal. And I think stupidity and lack of foresight and lack of ability to understand the strategic interest, because when push comes to shove, the congressmen and women, all of the congressional leaders are just thinking about one thing. They're not thinking about what's in the best interest of this country or of the people who are suffering. They're thinking about, how can I get reelected in the next 2 years, in the next 6 years, whether a senator or a congressperson. The only thing that they're thinking about is, I need money. That's the transactional nature of our politics. Now, speaking of transactional nature. So unless we break that cycle of how AIPAC and its surrogates threaten, and basically, let's be clear, Jamal, they threaten congressional representatives and senators, very clearly. If you want to get reelected, you know what you have to do. I mean, and at times it's that explicit. So unless we break that, AIPAC and its surrogates are going to have this stranglehold for quite some time. This is not in the best interest of the United States. You and I have been saying this for years. The amount of destabilization that the Israelis bring to the Middle East, to Africa, to other parts of the region are so damaging. It is not in the United States' best interest.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Let's visit George W. Bush.
Oh, speaking of whitewashing, Jamal, let's talk about George Bush.
Once in a while, he shows up, and recently, actually, George W. Has been hosted by popular talk shows. He goes to different talk shows. He's like,
right,
and especially during Trump, people kind of like missed him. And they were looking at him as this cuddly bear. If you look at the interviews, no questions about Iraq, no questions about Afghanistan, no questions about the millions of people who died, etc. They give him a pass. And
the war on terror.
And the war on terror, he just comes in and shows them that he has taken up painting, and he's auctioning his, portraits and so forth. So he was in, I think, Los Angeles at a speaker's tour, and his speech was interrupted. And we're going to show this, and so you can listen to what this veteran had to say.
When are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMD. 1 million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
Wow. Well, thank you, Michael Preisner. Thank you for your service, and thank you for standing up and confronting the whitewashing and the attempt to rewrite history about, what George W. Bush did in Iraq, what he did in Afghanistan, what he did in the name of the war on terror, what he did in terms of the million Iraqi children who died and the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who died, and the depleted uranium and the destabilization of the region, and what a disaster the Bush administration has bid for civil liberties even to this day. That took a lot of courage, Jamal.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it came at the right time because, right, as you know, the United States commemorated the horrific events of 9/11. And then I guess George Bush was asked to speak about this, and he's been speaking about it. Even though, I've seen him even during the, aside from his kind of cuddly bear tours, but he was critical of Trump. So on few things he was right, but he has no right kind of to talk about, or as this veteran, as you mentioned, Mike Prisoner, who basically asked him to apologize.
Absolutely.
He starts yelling at him, Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? He confronts him and he said, "You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about the connection to 9/11." And he was sent. He said, "I've lost friends." He served in Iraq because of a lie. Of course, they took him out of the hole, but the video became viral, and it's been circulating on the internet since last Monday.
Yeah.
Since this Monday, actually, it's been just making the rounds on the internet. That's why I wanted to talk about this.
Well, I think it's very appropriate to talk about Jamal, and let where does it begin? I mean, it begins with as far back as George Washington, our first president. But Bill Clinton has been on a let's rewrite history tour, despite a documentary that came out about his affair with Monica Lewinsky. George Bush and his administration have had arguably the most negative impact on destabilizing the Middle East and the region, as well as the attack on civil liberties and its impact on what's been happening to all of us in terms of the surveillance culture that still exists to this day, than anybody else in, at least recent history. And he has the audacity to criticize, President Biden for the way he pulled out of, Afghanistan. It was really kind of crazy that he had the audacity to do that. When he and his, administration, Jamal, they laid waste to Iraq and one of the greatest civilizations, of humankind, laid waste to it, laid, tons of depleted uranium on the people of Iraq, committed war crimes and atrocities in Iraq, and have left the Iraqis to this day, in complete, catastrophic, destabilized, government, unable to really function. So one voice can make a difference. I mean, how can we let George Bush off the hook and let him go around being a cuddly bear, selling art and criticizing the way we left Afghanistan when he started the war in Afghanistan? Jamal, he's the one that started.
Well, I mean, the crazy thing about it, Jess, okay, if you don't want to apologize to the Afghans and you don't want to apologize to the Iraqis, apologize to the vets and their families. All these people who died because of your lie. How about apologizing about lying to the American people? How about apologizing to lying at the United Nations Security Council when he sent Colin Powell, to show his so-called satellite photos and discuss that uranium and yellow cake was
the mobile units.
Yes.
Such a joke.
They concocted a lie that only exists in films, and movies, and they've never come forward. I mean, they've never come forward and say, they've never apologized. I think one time I heard Colin Powell, he came close to apologizing.
He
but
never
he
did,
didn't.
though, Jamal.
He said something like, "Oh, we got wrong intel." Who gave you the wrong intel? Wrong intel?
Yeah,
is that his excuse? Go and bomb a country like to the Stone Age because you received wrong intel?
And by the way, Jamal, just to add insult to injury, Condoleezza Rice within the last week or two was interviewed. She said the same thing. We got wrong intel. Well, the reality is, if you actually go back, they did get the right intel. They got accurate intel. Condoleezza Rice, in fact, got the memo and the intel about Osama bin Laden and, airplanes attacking the U.S. homeland. They got all that. What they did, Jamal, is chose to ignore the intelligence and chose to only focus on one aspect of the intelligence, which turned out to be false. So when Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice say they got the wrong intel, it's bogus. It's a complete fabrication.
Because I covered that war. I know everything that happened during that time.
That's right.
I know when they sent the international inspectors, and then international inspectors came back, and they said, we found nothing. They were going all over the place with their equipment and looking for radiation, any signs of
nothing.
They found nothing. So you know what their answer was then? Well, we've gotten rid of a dictator. I remember that. I'm paraphrasing. They shifted the attention. They tried to kind of shift the attention. Oh, we've done everyone. We've done the Iraqis a big favor. We've gotten rid of a dictator. That's one of their lies. The other lie, they tried to make the connection between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, which, by the way,
It's a joke.
It's a joke because Saddam Hussein was against anyone who resembled an Osama bin Laden. You know, he's not an Islamist. He's a socialist, you know, but definitely he was not going to ally himself.
But he also killed a lot of the Al-Qaeda-like types in Iraq when he was in power.
Al-Qaeda only came to Iraq
After they got rid of Osama.
After they killed Saddam Hussein. I mean, after the
Exactly.
Americans went into Iraq. So they did not exist. Yeah, he was a brutal dictator and a regime and what have you, but has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, had nothing to do with 9/11, and had nothing, and his nuclear program has stopped for years. He abandoned that program, and look what they've done. Look
Yeah.
what George Bush basically authorized.
Exactly. And so when George Bush criticizes President Biden, and trust me, Biden deserves criticism. That's not what I'm saying. But it's like the pot calling the kettle black, right? We are...
So I have a question for you quickly before you get into that. A little
what?
quiz. This is the most viral video for George W. Bush since when? Let me ask you.
Oh, I think it's...
Another viral video.
When he declared mission accomplished.
No, actually, that was a big one, a biggie, but there was one that went even more viral.
Which one?
Since the Iraqi journalist threw a shoe at him. Oh, yeah. so I was like thinking, which, what video made more hits or views? And actually,
that's got to be one of my all-time favorite videos.
That actually that video played millions and hundreds of millions of times over the internet. And then this one now, since that time, because George Bush has disappeared, they haven't heard of him that much, except he's, like I said, going to these talk shows. And this one is probably going to be just as big.
Well, it looks like we've come to another end of Arab Talk, Jamal.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com. You can download all our shows right there, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.